780 years ago, in an abandoned tavern on the outskirts of Konya, a man named Anwar the Silent was waiting for his own death. He had walked for 3 days without water, without food, without rest. Not because he was lost, but because he was trying to get lost. And then, just as the sun began to descend and the shadows stretched like open hands across the dirt floor, he heard a voice that would shatter everything he believed he understood about existence. Why do you seek to die when you have not yet learned to live? Anwar raised his eyes. Before him stood a man whose gaze appeared to hold entire centuries within it. A man whose name you already know. A man the Sufis call Maulana Rumi. What Rumi revealed to him that night is not recorded in any manuscript. It does not appear in the Masnavi. It is not transmitted in the academies of philosophy. But it is preserved in the hearts of those who have passed through the fire of divine love and returned to speak of it. If you are receiving these words right now, it is not coincidence. Your soul already recognizes what is approaching, because this is not an audiobook created to entertain your mind. It is a key to unlock a door you have been searching for your entire life without realizing you were searching for it. In the moments ahead, you are going to encounter something that Sufi masters have safeguarded for 8 centuries. Something that Ibn Arabi named the secret of the epiphanic mirrors. Something that Rumi described as dying before dying. And I tell you now, once you receive this, you will not be capable of returning to who you were. Anwar never returned. The question is, are you prepared not to return either? Breathe deeply. Close your eyes if you are able, and allow it to begin. Anwar had once been a man of remarkable means. He possessed 3 silk establishments in the bazaar of Damascus, a wife who cherished him deeply, 2 sons who raced toward him every time he came home. He had everything a man could reasonably desire. And yet, every night when he closed his eyes, he felt a void so profound it ached inside his chest like something hollow and restless. Do you know that feeling? That sensation that something more exists, something you cannot name, something that all your accomplishments, all your possessions, all your connections cannot fill. The Sufis have a name for that. Shauk, the sacred thirst. And Rumi told Anwar something that night in the tavern that altered everything. Thirst is not your adversary. It is your only genuine friend. Because when the thirst becomes stronger than the fear of losing everything, then, and only then, are you truly ready for the journey. Let me share something that most people fundamentally misunderstand about spiritual awakening. It is not a beautiful experience. It is not white light and a sensation of boundless peace. It is a stripping. It is the moment you recognize that everything you believed yourself to be, your name, your history, your achievements, your wounds, is not actually you. They are masks, layers of identity you have accumulated like dust settling on an ancient mirror. And awakening is not the act of adding more layers. It is the process of removing them all, one by one, until nothing remains but what was always there. Sufi dervishes have a practice that most people would consider extreme. It is called Khalwa, solitary retreat. Some practitioners spend 40 days confined in small, lightless rooms. No illumination, no distractions, nothing but themselves and the silence. And do you know what emerges in that silence? Everything you have been evading for years rises to the surface. Every fear, every shame, every deception you have fed yourself, every mask you have worn simply to endure, and you cannot flee. Because in silence, there is nowhere to conceal yourself. Anwar told us, through the stories that dervishes have carried from generation to generation, that during his third day without sustenance or water, something fractured inside him. It was not dramatic. There were no lightning strikes or mystical visions. He simply surrendered. And in that surrender, he heard the voice of Rumi asking something no one had ever asked him before. Who are you when you are no one? Consider that for a moment. Who are you when you remove your name, your profession, your family history, your traumas, your achievements? What remains? Modern scientists are beginning to discover what Sufis have recognized for centuries. The neuroscientist Andrew Newberg conducted research with Tibetan monks and Sufi dervishes during states of deep meditation. He discovered something extraordinary. When someone enters deep states of Fana, ego extinction, a specific region of the brain called the superior parietal lobe shuts down almost entirely. And do you know what that region is responsible for? It is the part that constructs your sense of a separate self. It is what generates the feeling that there is a you inside your mind that is distinct from the rest of existence. When that region goes quiet, the boundary between you and everything else dissolves. You are no longer you observing the world. You are the world observing itself. Rumi expressed this in the Masnavi centuries before neuroscience had words for it. You are a drop of water that has forgotten it is the ocean. But here is the dimension no one reveals to you. Remembering that you are the ocean means the drop must dissolve. And that is terrifying, because the drop has spent its entire existence building its identity, its small story, its narrow territory of water it can call mine. And now something is asking it to release all of that. Anwar asked Rumi that night, "How can I let go of everything I am without disappearing?" And Rumi smiled. That smile which dervishes describe as the sun rising in the center of the night. "There is your mistake," said Rumi. "You believe you are the drop, and you are afraid of vanishing. But what you cannot perceive is that the drop never existed. You were always the ocean. You had simply forgotten." Some years before encountering this story, I came across the account of Mansur al-Hallaj, one of the most extraordinary and controversial figures in Sufi history. In the year 922, in Baghdad, al-Hallaj walked through the streets declaring, "Ana al-Haq, I am the truth, I am God." The religious authorities considered this the gravest heresy imaginable. How could a mortal human being claim to be God? They arrested him, tortured him, and ultimately executed him. But before he died, as they led him toward the gallows, al-Hallaj was smiling. And when they demanded to know why he smiled in the face of death, he answered, "Who is going to die? The one you call Mansur never existed. I was always him, and he cannot die. For centuries, scholars debated whether Al-Hallaj was a saint or a madman, but Rumi understood him completely. Rumi wrote of him, "Al-Hallaj was executed not for speaking a lie, but for speaking a truth too soon. The people were not yet ready to hear that there is no separation between the lover and the beloved." Do you perceive the paradox? The greatest obstacle to awakening is not your ignorance. It is your need to be someone. It is your addiction to the story of I. And here is what Anwar discovered that night in the tavern. The thirst you carry, that void which no relationship, no achievement, no possession can fill, is not a problem requiring a solution. It is the solution itself. Because that thirst is the only thing within you that is completely real. It is the ocean calling the drop. It is God calling you back home. And the journey home begins the moment you stop running from that thirst and start following it. But following it means being willing to lose everything. Not metaphorically, literally. The Sufis have a saying, "Die before dying." They are not speaking of a physical death. They are speaking of dying to your idea of who you are. Dying to your need for control. Dying to your story. Dying to everything that is not real. And when you die to all of that, something impossible occurs. You are born for the very first time. Anwar asked Rumi something that perhaps you too are asking yourself at this very moment. How do I know if I am ready? And Rumi answered with words I will repeat to you exactly as he said them. You will not know, because being ready means ceasing to ask whether you are ready. Being ready means the thirst has grown so powerful that you no longer care whether you survive the journey. You care only about the truth. There is a Sufi practice called Muraqaba, observation of the heart. It is not meditation in the modern sense. You are not attempting to calm your mind or generate a feeling of peace. You are observing. Observing every thought that surfaces, every emotion, every impulse, every fear, every desire. And you do not judge them. You do not suppress them. You do not chase them. You simply observe, as if you were a vast sky watching clouds drift through it. And gradually, you begin to recognize something astonishing. None of those thoughts are you. None of those emotions are you. They are events occurring within you, but they are not you. So who are you? You are the space in which all of it happens. You are the consciousness that observes. And that consciousness has no beginning and no end. It carries no form. It holds no history. It is eternal. It is infinite. It is what the Sufis call al-Haq, the ultimate reality. It is what Rumi named the beloved. It is what you have been searching for across your entire life without realizing it has always been here. Anwar spent that first night in the tavern with Rumi largely in silence. They did not speak much after that opening conversation. Rumi simply sat across from him and looked at him. And in that gaze, Anwar felt something he had never experienced before. He felt that someone was truly seeing him, not his mask, not his personality, not his accumulated story. He was seeing Anwar's essence, what he truly was beneath all the layers. And in that moment, something inside Anwar began to crumble. It was not precisely pain. It was as though all the walls he had constructed over the decades were beginning to fall. And behind those walls, there was light. A light that had always been present, but which he had covered with so many layers of identity that he had entirely forgotten it existed. The dervishes have a word for that moment, baraka, blessing. But it is not a blessing that descends from outside. It is a blessing that awakens from within. When Anwar finally spoke, he could only articulate one thing. I have been looking in the wrong place my entire life. And Rumi answered, you were not looking in the wrong place. You were looking with the wrong eyes. Because what you seek cannot be perceived with the eyes of the body. It can only be seen with the eyes of the heart. Ibn Arabi, the Grand Master of Sufism, born in Murcia in 1165, articulated something that fundamentally altered my understanding when I first encountered it. He said that every human being is an epiphanic mirror. What does that mean precisely? It means you are a mirror in which the divine perceives itself. Consider this carefully. A mirror possesses nothing. It clings to no image. Images appear within it. They pass through. They dissolve. And the mirror remains open, receptive, empty, ready to receive the next image without holding the previous one. If you attempt to cling to an image, the mirror clouds over. It can no longer reflect with clarity. Your ego is that cloudiness. It is the accumulation of all the images you have grasped and declared, this is me. And the process of Fana, ego extinction, is the cleaning of that mirror. Not the destruction of it, the cleaning of it. Modern science is approaching this understanding from a completely different angle. The neuroscientist Donald Hoffman proposes something that sounds almost impossibly radical. The reality we perceive is not actual reality. It is an interface, similar to the visual interface of your computer. When you select a file icon on your screen, you are not seeing the electrons and machine code operating beneath the surface. You are seeing a simplified representation that your mind can navigate. The same principle applies to your sense of self. The I you believe yourself to be, your personality, your history, your identity, is not who you truly are. It is an interface, a useful simplification your brain constructed to help you move through the world. But it is not real in the deepest sense of that word. Rumi understood this 8 centuries before neuroscience developed language for it, and he expressed it in the most alive way I have ever encountered. You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop. Anwar asked Rumi that second evening, if I must die before dying, how do I actually do it? And Rumi offered him his first practice, the silent Dhikr. Dhikr means remembrance, but it is not a mental exercise. It is an existential reminder, a practice of returning. The practice is elegantly simple. With every inhalation, you hold within you the thought, he. With every exhalation, lives. He lives. Not I breathe, he breathes. Not I exist, he exists. Not I love, he loves through me. That sounds accessible enough, but try it for 5 minutes and observe what occurs. Your mind will revolt. It will insist, this is absurd. Of course it is I who breathes. I am in control. And there is the entire mechanism of ego laid completely bare. Because you are not in control. You never were. Your heart beats without your instruction. Your cells regenerate without your permission. Your blood moves through you without your deliberate direction. Who is orchestrating all of that? The Sufis would answer without hesitation, Him, the presence, the one consciousness, the real. And you, the small I that imagines itself to be in command, are only a wave in that infinite ocean. A wave that has temporarily forgotten it is the ocean itself. But here is the dimension that transforms everything. The forgetting is intentional. The divine forgot being divine in order to experience the return home. Rumi expressed this directly. I forgot my way home so that I could experience the ecstasy of returning. It is like the game of hide and seek you engaged in as a child. You concealed yourself, and the pleasure was never in remaining hidden. The pleasure was in being found. God concealed himself inside you, inside every living being, and now he is engaged in the sacred game of finding himself. And when you find yourself, when you remember who you truly are, that is what the Sufis call baqa, permanence in God. Because Fana, ego extinction, is only half of the journey. The other half is baqa. It is dying and then being reborn as something entirely new. Not new in the sense of different, new in the sense of original, primordial, what you always were before you forgot. Anwar practiced the Dhikr through that entire night. He lives, he lives, he lives. And at some point near dawn, something shifted beneath the words. It was no longer Anwar saying, he lives. It was the presence saying through Anwar, I live. And for the first time in his existence, Anwar understood what Al-Hallaj had meant when he cried out, Ana al-Haq. It was not arrogance, it was recognition. It was the truth recognizing itself in the mirror it had always been. Rumi observed this shift in his eyes and simply said, Now you are beginning to die. And Anwar, for the first time in his life, was not afraid. Because he recognized something fundamental. You cannot die if you were never born in the way you imagined. You cannot lose what you never truly possessed. You cannot cease to be what you have always been. The ego can die. The personality can dissolve. The story can reach its final page. But you, the consciousness that witnesses all of it, cannot die. Because you were not born in time. you have always been present, and you always will be. The dervishes have a ceremony that embodies this truth in the most visually extraordinary way I have ever witnessed. It is called Sama, the dance of the Whirling Dervishes. You may have encountered images of it. Men clothed entirely in white, spinning in endless circles, arms extended wide, one hand reaching toward the sky, the other directed toward the earth. But do you understand what it truly represents? It is not merely a beautiful ceremony. It is a physical enactment of Fana and Baka happening simultaneously. As they spin, they die to themselves. The disorientation, the surrender of fixed balance, the release of the stable perspective. All of it represents the death of the ego. Their right arm extends toward the sky, receiving from the source of all things. Their left arm points toward the earth, giving back to the world. They possess nothing. They are only receiving and giving, channels, not containers. And as they spin and continue spinning, something extraordinary becomes visible to anyone watching closely. The center of their spinning becomes perfectly still. On the exterior, everything is movement and apparent chaos. But at the very center, at the axis around which everything revolves, there is absolute stillness. That is the paradox of awakening. On the outside, your life continues its motion. There are changes and challenges and losses. But inside, at the center of your being, there is a stillness that never shifts, a silence that is never broken, a presence that never departs. The Sufis call this sukoon, divine tranquility, and it is not something you achieve through effort or accumulation. It is something you discover was always there, waiting beneath the noise. Rumi told Anwar something that night that I want you to carry forward with you into your own life. Divine love is not an emotion. It is not a feeling that rises and falls with circumstances. It is a fire, and that fire consumes everything that is not real. Your pride, your shame, your need to be recognized as special, your terror of being ordinary, your attachments, your aversions, everything. And when everything has been consumed, what remains is pure love. Love that requires no object. Love that seeks no return. Love that simply is. Anwar wept that night, not from sadness, from relief, because for the first time in his existence, he gave himself permission to release everything, to set down all the masks, to cease the performance, to stop the struggle, to simply be. And in that being, without effort, without pretension, without armor, he found something he had been reaching toward his entire life: peace. Not the peace of having resolved everything, the peace of recognizing that nothing requires resolution. Not the peace of an absence of problems, the peace of understanding that problems are part of the living experience, and that this is entirely acceptable. The Sufis have a practice I want to offer you now. It is called muhasaba, self-observation. At the close of each day, you sit and observe everything that occurred, not from a position of judgment, but from a place of pure neutrality. Today, I raised my voice at someone I love. Not, I am a harmful person for doing that. Simply, the anger appeared. Today, I felt jealous of someone I admire. Not, something is deeply wrong with me. Simply, the jealousy appeared. Do you sense the difference? You are not the anger. You are not the jealousy. These are events that move through you like clouds moving across an open sky. The sky does not transform into a cloud, it simply allows them to pass. And gradually, day by day, practice by practice, you begin to identify less with the cloud and more with the sky itself. Anwar asked, "How long does this process take?" Rumi laughed with genuine warmth. As long as it takes you to stop asking how long it takes. Because the ego desires a plan. It wants to know, if I perform X for Y duration, I will obtain Z result. But awakening does not operate that way. It is not an achievement. It is a surrender. And you cannot schedule a surrender. You can only surrender. But there is genuinely good news. Once you begin to surrender, once you begin to release, the universe begins to conspire in your favor. You start noticing synchronicities. You begin encountering people who reflect back precisely what you need to see. You begin having experiences that feel designed specifically for you, because in reality, they are. Everything is designed specifically for you, because everything is Him. There are no accidents. There are no coincidences. There is only presence, playing with itself, hiding from itself, finding itself again. Anwar fell into sleep that night for the first time in 3 days. And he dreamed. He dreamed he was a wave in the ocean, and the wave was terrified of dying, because it believed that when it crashed against the shore, it would cease to exist entirely. And then it heard a voice, the voice of the ocean itself. You are not the wave, beloved. I am the wave, and I do not die. I only change form. When Anwar opened his eyes, Rumi was sitting before him, watching him with those eyes that seemed to perceive through every surface and every story. You are ready, said Rumi simply. Ready for what? Asked Anwar. For the wound, answered Rumi. And Anwar did not yet understand what he meant. But he was about to discover it, because the next step of this journey was not an ascent. It was a descent into the place he had spent his entire life most carefully avoiding, the place of his deepest pain, the place of his most significant wound. Because, as Rumi was preparing to show him, the wound is not the obstacle. The wound is the portal. There is a frequency that resonates across genuine seekers, something beyond belief, beyond technique, beyond intellectual understanding. The number 777 appears across traditions not as superstition, but as a marker of what the Sufis would call kamal, completion of a cycle, the moment when inner and outer reality begin to align. If something in what you have heard tonight felt less like new information and more like remembering something ancient, something your deeper self already carried, then you are already in motion. You have already begun. This is MindRise Audiobooks. The journey continues. Began with fire. Not the fire of burning wood or consuming flame, but the fire Rumi had spoken of. The fire that does not destroy what is real. The fire that only burns away what was never truly yours to begin with. And Anwar, sitting in that abandoned tavern on the outskirts of Konya, was about to discover what it meant to be consumed by something far greater than himself. Rumi asked him something strange as the darkness gathered around them. Have you ever been so completely in love that you forgot your own name? Anwar thought carefully. He thought of his wife Salima, of tender moments and years of shared life, of his sons Hassan and Amira, of the particular warmth that arises between people who have chosen one another across time. Yes, he answered, I believe I have. Rumi shook his head slowly. No, you have not, because if you had, truly had, you would not be here. You would already be dead. Anwar frowned. I don't understand. And then Rumi told him a story that would reorder everything Anwar thought he knew about love, about service, and about the nature of what belongs to us. There was once a dervish who served his master for 40 years. 40 years cleaning his sandals. 40 years preparing his food before the sun rose. 40 years sleeping on a cold floor while his master slept in comfort. And not once, not a single time across those 4 decades did the master say, "Thank you." Not once did he say, "I am proud of you." Not once did he acknowledge the depth of what the dervish offered. The dervish gave and gave and gave, and the master received in silence, as though it were simply the natural order of things. Then one day, emissaries arrived from a distant land. The Maharaja of India had died without an heir. They had traveled far to consult the master, asking him to recommend someone worthy of the throne. The dervish, hearing this from the doorway, felt his heart quicken. 40 years, 40 years of service. Surely now, finally, the master would look at him and say the words he had been waiting a lifetime to hear. But the master looked at the dervish and said only this, "Go to the kitchen. The rice in the large pot needs stirring. I will handle this." The dervish obeyed. He walked to the kitchen. He picked up the wooden spoon and began to stir. And as he stirred, something extraordinary happened. The master appeared before him as though materializing from the very air of the room. And he spoke in a voice unlike any the dervish had heard before. "I am going to make you the Maharaja of India. But there is one condition. When you arrive there, you will become extraordinarily wealthy. You will possess palaces, treasures beyond counting, a family of great beauty, everything a man could possibly desire. And when that time comes, I will visit you. And when I visit, you will give me exactly half of everything you have." The dervish, overcome with a joy he could barely contain, agreed without hesitation. "Master, everything I have will be yours. I am and have always been your servant." "No," said the master, his eyes steady. "I do not want everything, only half. Remember that, only half." Years passed. The dervish became Maharaja. He constructed 6 palaces of extraordinary beauty. He accumulated treasures that filled rooms upon rooms. He married a princess of grace and intelligence. They had 3 children together, 2 sons and a daughter, and in each of them he saw a miracle he had never expected to be granted. Life became full in ways he had never imagined possible during those 40 years on the cold floor. And then, one morning, a messenger arrived. The master was coming to visit. The Maharaja felt the old joy of seeing his teacher, and beneath it, something else, something quieter and more uncomfortable. He called his treasury minister immediately. "How much gold do I possess?" 1 billion pieces, Your Majesty." "Adjust the records. Record 1 million. He called his estate manager. "How many palaces are listed under my name?" 6, Your Majesty." "Transfer 4 of them to my wife's name. Let only 2 appear as mine." The master arrived. He embraced the Maharaja with that particular warmth that only genuine teachers possess, a warmth without agenda, without need, pure as water. He looked at him with those eyes that had always seen through every surface, and he said, "Do you remember our agreement, my dear?" "Of course," answered the Maharaja smoothly. "I have 2 palaces. 1 is yours. I have 1 million pieces of gold. 500,000 belong to you." The master nodded slowly. He looked around at the palace, at the gardens, at the life this man had built. "How generous," he said quietly. "And your wife? Your children?" "I have 3 children, master. Take 1 if you wish, or 2. The master shook his head. "No, an agreement is an agreement. I want exactly half." And he reached beneath his robe and drew a sword. "I will divide the 3rd child precisely in 2, 1/2 for you, 1/2 for me." The Maharaja cried out with everything in him, "No, please, they are my children, you cannot." And in his desperation, his hand found a dagger at his belt. He drew it. He lunged at his master. And in that instant, he opened his eyes. He was still in the kitchen, still holding the wooden spoon, still stirring the rice in the large pot. The master stood before him, watching him with those ancient, patient, all-seeing eyes. "You see," said the master gently, "you are not yet ready to be Maharaja, because you still believe something belongs to you." Anwar listened to this story with tears moving quietly down his face. When Rumi finished, Anwar could only ask, "What does it mean, truly mean?" Rumi leaned forward. His voice dropped to something close to a whisper. "It means that dying before dying is not a poetic metaphor for the spiritually inclined. It is literal. You must be willing to lose everything: your possessions, your family, your life, your identity, your story about who you are, everything. And not merely willing in theory, you must genuinely return it all. Because nothing is yours. It never was. Everything belongs to the one presence. And as long as you believe something belongs to you, as long as you reach for the dagger when that belief is threatened, you cannot be free. Now let me clarify something that most people misunderstand about Sufism, because it matters enormously here. When the Sufis speak of dying before dying, they are not instructing you to abandon your family. They are not telling you to surrender your possessions and withdraw from life into a cave somewhere remote. They are speaking of something far more radical than any external renunciation. They are speaking of releasing your attachment to those things. And releasing attachment does not mean ceasing to love. It means loving without possessing, loving without needing, loving without clinging so tightly that the loss of the thing would destroy you. Ibn Arabi, who mapped the inner geography of this territory more precisely than perhaps anyone else in history, described every human being as an epiphanic mirror. And a mirror, by its very nature, possesses nothing. Images arise in it. They exist fully within it, and then they pass. And the mirror does not mourn them. The mirror does not attempt to hold them beyond their natural time. It simply remains, open, clear, ready to receive whatever comes next with complete presence. Your ego is the cloudiness that accumulates on that mirror. Every belief you have clutched and called, "This is me," every identity you have defended, every story you have protected, every wound you have carried as evidence of your particular significance, all of that is the cloudiness. And Fana, the ego extinction that Rumi was guiding Anwar toward, is not the destruction of the mirror. It is simply the cleaning of it, the return to clarity, the return to what was always there beneath the accumulation. The neuroscientist Donald Hoffman has proposed something that the scientific community continues to grapple with. The reality we perceive is not actual reality. It is an interface, a useful simplification that our brains generate to help us navigate existence. When you look at the icon on your computer screen, you are not seeing the electrons and machine code. You are seeing a representation your mind can work with. The self you believe yourself to be operates by the same principle. It is a useful representation, but it is not the underlying reality. The underlying reality is something your instruments of ordinary perception were not designed to detect. Rumi understood this not through equations or experiments, but through direct encounter with the truth itself. And he expressed it this way: "You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop." But Anwar still had a question that would not release him. "If love is the path," he said to Rumi, "then why did loving my family not bring me peace? Why did loving my work not fill the void? I loved genuinely, I believe, and still the thirst remained." Rumi was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that is itself a teaching. "Because you were loving with the ego's love," he finally said. "The ego's love is always a form of need. I love you because you make me feel significant. I love you because your presence confirms my existence. I love you because without you, I am afraid of what I might discover about myself." That is not love. That is dependency wearing love's clothing. Divine love, the love the Sufis call ishq, is something entirely different. It is love that does not need the other person to be any particular way. It does not need them to stay. it does not need them to return what it gives. It loves because it is the nature of consciousness to love. The same way it is the nature of the sun to give light without keeping a record of who receives it. Anwar practiced the Dhikr throughout that second night. He breathes. He breathes. He breathes. And somewhere in the depths of those hours, something began to shift beneath the practice. Something Anwar could not have described with language even if he had tried. It was as though the one who was practicing the Dhikr gradually became less solid, less fixed, less certain of where he ended and the silence began. And in that dissolution, something else became perceptible. Something that had been present the entire time, behind all the noise, beneath all the years of searching. The Sufis describe this state, this first genuine glimpse, with a word that cannot be adequately translated. How? A spiritual state, a gift that arrives without effort and cannot be summoned by will. It comes like light through a crack. It illuminates everything, and then it passes. And what you are left with is the knowledge that the light is real, that it was not imagined, and that the crack through which it entered was always there. The dervishes have a ceremony that carries this truth in its very structure. Sama, the whirling. You have perhaps seen images, men dressed entirely in white, spinning in great continuous circles, one arm extended toward the sky and the other toward the earth. But understanding what you are seeing requires more than the image itself. As they spin, they are dying. The dizziness, the loss of the fixed reference point, the dissolution of the ordinary sense of up and down and here and there, all of it is a physical enactment of the ego's dissolution. Their right hand points upward, receiving from the divine. Their left hand points toward the ground, giving to the world. They are not holders. They are channels. Nothing passes through a channel and remains there. It flows in and flows out, and the channel is simply the means by which the current moves. And here is what becomes visible to anyone who watches the Sama with genuine attention. At the very center of all that spinning, at the axis around which every movement revolves, there is perfect stillness. The exterior is all motion and velocity and the blur of white fabric. But the center does not move. The center has never moved. The center is the silence that the motion serves. That is what the Sufis call sukoon, divine tranquility. And it is not a state you manufacture. It is a state you uncover again and again beneath everything that is moving. Rumi told Anwar something during that second night that I want you to hold carefully. There are people who spend their entire lives seeking peace by eliminating everything that disturbs them. They simplify and withdraw and control and arrange, and they never find it, because what they are seeking cannot be found by removing disturbance from the outside. It can only be discovered by finding the center that disturbance cannot reach. And that center, that stillness at the axis of everything spinning, is not something you build. It has always been there. You have simply been too busy chasing the spinning to notice. There is a concept that quantum physicists and contemplative masters have arrived at through entirely different routes, and the convergence is impossible to dismiss. The observer, in quantum mechanics, is not separate from what is observed. The act of observation participates in the creation of what is observed. Consciousness is not a passive receiver of a reality that exists independently of it. Consciousness is woven into the fabric of what appears. This is not philosophy. This is what the mathematics describe when followed rigorously to their conclusion. The Sufis arrived at this understanding through a different path entirely, through the direct investigation of the self, through the practice of Fana, through the burning away of everything that separates the observer from the observed. And what they discovered was not different from what the equations suggest. The separation between the seer and the seen is a construction. It is real at one level of experience, the level at which we navigate daily life, but it is not real at the level of ultimate reality. At the deepest level, there is only the one consciousness, appearing as everything, experiencing itself through every form. Rumi taught Anwar a second practice that night. It is a practice so simple that the mind immediately underestimates it and moves on searching for something more complex. It is called the contemplation of impermanence. Every evening before sleep, you sit quietly and bring to mind everything you possess: your health, your relationships, your work, your home, your capacities. And you ask yourself, with genuine honesty, not as a spiritual exercise, but as a real question: if I lost this tomorrow, could I still be at peace? Not, would I be happy? Not, would it be painless? But, could you still be at peace, even in the loss? This is not a practice designed to make you indifferent to what you love. It is a practice designed to discover where your peace is actually rooted. If your peace depends on your health remaining stable, then your peace is as fragile as your health. If your peace depends on your most important relationships remaining unchanged, then your peace is as fragile as those relationships. But if your peace is rooted in something that cannot be taken, in that presence at the center of the spinning, in that stillness that no storm has ever actually disturbed, then you can lose everything and still remain at peace. Not because you are beyond feeling, but because you know in your bones and not just in your mind who you truly are, and what you truly are cannot be lost. Anwar practiced this through the night. He imagined losing his business. He imagined losing his home. He imagined losing his sons, Hassan and Amira. He imagined losing Salima. He imagined losing his own life. And every time the fear arose, and the fear arose powerfully, as it always does when the ego believes itself to be threatened, he returned to the same question: who am I beyond all of this? And every time, beneath the fear and beneath the grief that fear carried with it, the same answer was waiting. Presence, consciousness, pure being. Not Anwar the merchant, not Anwar the husband, not Anwar the father. Something that preceded all of those names and would remain when all of those names had dissolved. And and it cannot die, because it was not born. It has always been. It will always be. The third morning arrived. The sun came through the gaps in the tavern walls in long, slow bars of gold. Rumi looked at Anwar the way a master looks at a student who has genuinely begun to understand, with a recognition that is not quite pride, because pride belongs to the ego, but something deeper, a kind of reflection. As though Rumi were seeing something in Anwar that Anwar was only now beginning to see in himself. "You are ready," said Rumi. "For what?" asked Anwar. Rumi stood. He walked toward the door of the tavern, and he said, over his shoulder, without drama, "For the wound, come." They walked together as the city of Konya was waking, through streets that smelled of bread and water and the particular mineral scent of stone warmed by early sun. The dervishes they passed bowed their heads. Street children paused to watch. A cat observed them from a high wall with the sovereign indifference that cats alone possess. And Rumi led Anwar to a cemetery. They walked among the graves in a silence that felt entirely different from the silence of the tavern, a silence that was outside now, held by the open sky rather than by walls. The graves were simple, most of them, plain stone markers in the early light. And finally, Rumi stopped before one in particular. It had no inscription, only a worn stone slab polished by decades of hands that had come to touch it. "My master is buried here," said Rumi, and for the first time since Anwar had known him, across all those nights, across all those teachings, he saw tears forming in Rumi's eyes. Shams of Tabriz. Rumi sat before the grave. Anwar sat beside him, and Rumi began to speak of the wound that had made him who he was. "When Shams disappeared, I believed I was going to die. Not as metaphor, literally. I felt my heart divide into two halves that could not find each other. For months I searched for him everywhere. I asked every traveler who passed through. I sent messengers to distant cities. Have you seen a man with eyes like no other eyes? Have you seen a man whose smile makes you understand, without knowing why, that everything is going to be all right?" And no one had seen him. Rumi paused. The tears were moving on his face now. "For months I could not eat. I could not sleep with any depth. I walked in circles through the streets of Konya like a man whose compass had been destroyed. My family believed I had lost my mind entirely. My students dispersed. I was left with nothing but the pain. And then, one night, very late, when the pain had finally exhausted even my capacity to resist it, something changed. There is a number that appears with peculiar consistency in the lives of those who undergo genuine transformation, not as magic, not as superstition, but as a marker of a specific kind of alignment, the alignment that becomes possible only after the ego has been genuinely broken open. 333. Half of 666, which the mystical traditions understood not as evil, but as the number of material existence, the world as it appears, and 333 as the midpoint, the threshold, the place where the material and the divine are in precise balance. The Sufis would recognize this, not in the number itself, but in the state it points toward the state of being precisely between who you were and who you are becoming. That was where Rumi stood before his master's grave on the morning that Anwar began to truly understand. "I realized," said Rumi, "that Shams had not gone. He had never left, because what I loved in Shams was never his physical presence. It was the presence that moved through him, the light that shone from behind his eyes. And that presence is everywhere. It was in me. It was in the stones of the street. It was in the grief itself. My wound became my door." He turned to look at Anwar directly. "The wound is the place where the light enters you." Anwar sat with those words for a long time. The morning birds were singing in the cypresses that lined the cemetery wall. Somewhere in the city, a muezzin was calling, and Anwar felt something he had not been able to feel in 30 years. The particular weight of a grief he had been carrying without ever setting it down. Because Rumi's words had opened something in him, not gently, the way a key opens a lock, precise, mechanical, inevitable. When Anwar was 15 years old, his younger brother had drowned in a river. Anwar had been there. He had watched it happen, and he could not save him. For 30 years he had carried that, not as memory exactly, but as a permanent background weight, a guilt so familiar it had become indistinguishable from his personality, so old it felt like simply the shape of who he was. "I should have been faster," he said to Rumi now. It was the first time he had ever said it to another living person. "I should have seen the danger. I should have saved him." Rumi listened without moving, without offering comfort in any ordinary sense. He simply listened in the way that very few people ever learn to listen, with his entire being, without the agenda of making the pain stop. When Anwar finished, Rumi asked him one question. "Can you save him now?" Anwar blinked. "No, he is already gone." "Then why," said Rumi gently, "are you still carrying what you cannot change?" "Because it was my fault." Was it, or was it what had to happen? Anwar felt rage move through him, the sudden, clean rage of someone whose wound has been touched without permission. "How can you say that? He was only a child." And Rumi answered him with a gentleness that was somehow more devastating than any argument could have been. "I am not saying it does not hurt. I am not saying it was not a tragedy. What I am saying is this. Carrying guilt for something that has already passed is an attempt to change the past, and the past cannot be changed. The only thing available to you now, in this moment, is to feel the pain completely, without resistance, without the armor of guilt, and to allow that pain to open you, because inside that pain is hidden the exact compassion you need to live the rest of your life." Anwar wept, and this time, for the first time in 30 years, the weeping was not a weeping of resistance. It was a weeping of surrender. He stopped fighting the grief. He stopped trying to be adequate in the face of it. He let it move through him the way a river moves through its channel, not stopped, not controlled, simply allowed. And when it passed, not disappeared but passed, something strange and unexpected remained. A lightness, not happiness, not resolution, simply the absence of the weight he had been carrying so long he had forgotten it was possible to put it down. This is MindRise Audiobooks, and the journey is only deepening. The fourth night arrived like a held breath finally released. Anwar had returned from the cemetery carrying something he could not name. Not the weight he had carried before, but something different. Something that felt less like a burden and more like an opening. As though the weeping in the cemetery had not emptied him, but had simply made more room inside. Room for something that had been waiting a very long time to enter. Rumi did something unexpected that evening. He asked Anwar to find a glass. Anwar searched the abandoned tavern until he located an old ceramic cup near the back wall, dusty and chipped at the rim. He handed it to Rumi. Rumi held it for a moment with the particular attention he gave to everything. The attention of someone for whom no object is ordinary. And then he filled it with water from a clay jug. He filled it to the very brim, completely full. Not a drop of space remaining. "Now," said Rumi, "add more water." Anwar took the jug. He tilted it carefully over the cup. The water ran immediately over the rim and fell to the dirt floor, spreading into the dust. "I cannot," said Anwar. "It is already full." Rumi set the cup down and looked at him with those eyes that contained centuries. "Exactly. And that is the precise condition of your heart, full of desires, full of fears, full of stories about who you are and what you need and what you lack, full of I want and I do not want, full of attachments to what you have and aversions to what might come, full of the accumulated identity of a lifetime. And into a heart that is completely full, how can anything new enter? How can the presence pour itself into what has no space to receive it?" Then Rumi tilted the cup. The water fell to the floor. The cup was empty. "Now," he said quietly, "it is ready." And Anwar understood something in that moment that no amount of explanation could have conveyed. It was not about acquiring more knowledge. It was not about accumulating more spiritual experiences, or more extraordinary encounters, or more wisdom from more teachers. It was about emptying, about releasing, about the radical act of creating space within yourself for something that cannot be forced to enter. It can only be invited by the quality of your receptivity. There is a concept in Sufism that resists translation into English with any real accuracy. Fakur. Literally, it means poverty. But it is not material poverty, and it carries none of the suffering that material poverty brings. It is spiritual poverty. Spiritual emptiness, the deliberate cultivation of inner spaciousness. And the Sufis regard it not as deprivation, but as the greatest possible wealth. Because only what is empty can be genuinely filled. Only what has released its claim on what it already holds can receive what is waiting to enter. Only the cup that has been poured out can contain the wine. Jesus expressed this same understanding from within a different tradition. "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The mystics of every genuine lineage arrived at this same recognition through their own routes. The full cup cannot be filled. The conditioned mind cannot perceive what lies beyond conditioning. The ego cannot encounter what exists beyond ego, because the encounter itself would require the very dissolution it is attempting to protect itself against. And your heart has been full your entire life, full of conditioning absorbed before you were old enough to question it, full of beliefs about who you are and who you are not, what you deserve and what you do not, what is possible for someone like you, and what is forever beyond your reach. Full of comparisons and judgments and expectations of yourself and of everyone around you. Full of the exhausting need to be special, or at minimum to avoid being ordinary. Full of the stories that were told to you and the stories you constructed to survive the ones that were told to you. And all of that filling, all of that accumulated weight of identity has paradoxically left a deeper emptiness, the emptiness of not knowing who you actually are beneath all of it. Rumi taught Anwar a practice that night called Dhikr of the heart. It is distinct from the Dhikr Anwar had already been practicing. That one used words, the breath carrying "he lives" through the body like a current. This one uses no words at all. It is done with pure presence. The practice is this. You sit in silence. You close your eyes. You bring your attention, not your thoughts, your attention, to the center of your chest, the spiritual heart, not the physical organ, but the space at the center of your being that every tradition in every culture has identified as the seat of genuine knowing. And you simply remain there, without analyzing what you find, without judging whether you are doing it correctly, without looking for results or measuring your progress, without doing anything except being present in the heart. When thoughts arise, and they will arise with remarkable persistence and remarkable creativity, you do not fight them. You do not attempt to suppress them or push them away. You do not follow them down the paths they open. You simply notice them, as you might notice clouds passing over a landscape you are observing from a distance. And you return. Return to the heart. Return to the silence. Again and again. Heart, clouds. Heart, clouds. Heart. And gradually, not quickly, and not according to any schedule the mind would find satisfying, something changes. The clouds begin to thin. The intervals between thoughts begin to extend. And in those intervals, in the spaces between one thought and the next, there is a silence that is not the mere absence of sound. It is a silence that is alive, vibrant, aware, a silence that appears to be made of consciousness itself. The Sufis call this the presence, not a presence separate from you that you are approaching from the outside, the presence at the center of what you are. God, not as an external being residing somewhere above the clouds, but as the very substance of your awareness. the consciousness through which you are conscious, the knowing by which you know. Anwar practiced this for hours that fourth night. His mind was relentless in the beginning, as all minds are, as every genuine practitioner throughout history has discovered. Am I doing this correctly? How much longer must I sit? Why do I feel nothing remarkable? Perhaps I lack the particular quality required for this. Perhaps this path is not available to someone with my history, my failures, my accumulated years of not knowing. Rumi had warned him. The first 1,000 thoughts are the loudest. Let them pass. They are not reality. They are only the ego in the last stages of defending its throne. Because this is precisely what is happening during deep practice. The ego is genuinely losing its grip. It is losing the control it has exercised over your experience for your entire life. And it does not release that control quietly or gracefully. It goes screaming. But if you do not feed the screaming, if you simply continue returning to the heart without engaging the protest, eventually the screaming exhausts itself. And then silence, real silence, the kind that has no bottom. Modern neuroscience has recently developed the capacity to observe what occurs in the brain during these states, and the findings are extraordinary in their specificity. There is a neural network called the default mode network, the network responsible for what your brain does when it is not engaged in any particular task. For most people, in most moments, this network is generating thoughts about the self. What will they think of me? Am I adequate? What should I do tomorrow? What should I have done differently yesterday? It is the constant interior narrator, the one who is always telling the story of you, always evaluating, always planning, always comparing the present to some other imagined arrangement. And it turns out this network is active almost continuously, even during sleep, even during activities that appear to require the mind's full attention. The narrator rarely rests. But during deep states of meditation, during genuine inner silence, that network quiets. And the network that becomes active in its place is something entirely different. The network associated with pure awareness, pure presence, the experience of experience, without the narrator inserting himself between the experience and the one having it. Just this, just now, without commentary. People who practice this regularly report consistent changes. Less identification with the stories their minds generate, less reactivity to circumstances that previously would have consumed them, a sense, not as intellectual conviction, but as lived experience, of being part of something larger than the small story they had been inhabiting. Not because they convinced themselves of it through argument, because they experienced it directly, in the silence, when the narrator finally grew quiet enough to allow it. Anwar's first genuine glimpse arrived somewhere near midnight of that fourth night. There was no drama to it, no light, no vision, no sensation of extraordinary magnitude. The thoughts simply stopped, not because he stopped them, but because they stopped themselves, the way a river sometimes pauses in a natural basin before continuing its course. And in that stillness, Anwar felt something, Not an emotion, not a thought. Something prior to both. Something that was simply present without needing anything to be different. Consciousness being conscious of itself without an object, without a subject, without the architecture of I and not I that ordinarily structures every experience. And in that moment, without any reasoning leading him there, Anwar understood something he had been circling for 3 days without being able to touch. Everything he had been searching for, the peace, the fullness, the sense of being genuinely home, had never been in the future. It had never been the result of achieving something, or becoming something, or finding something outside himself. It was here. It had always been here, at the center of the very awareness with which he had been conducting the entire search. When he opened his eyes, Rumi was watching him. "You saw," said Rumi simply. Anwar could not speak, because this is the nature of genuine recognition. It returns you to a silence deeper than any words that could attempt to describe it. The Sufis have a phrase that has been passed down for this precise situation. He who tastes knows. You cannot understand wine from a description. You cannot understand fire from a diagram. You must taste and be burned, and then you know. Not as belief, not as conviction, but as direct, unmediated, inarguable experience. And once you know in that way, no argument can reach it, because it is no longer located in the part of you that arguments address. But here is the challenge that Rumi was careful to name. What Anwar had touched, that glimpse of pure presence, was only a beginning. It was what the Sufis call hal, a spiritual state. A gift that arrives without being summoned and departs without permission. Beautiful, real, transformative, and temporary. Rumi explained, "What you experienced is hal, a state. It comes as grace. It also leaves as grace. The grace is in the coming, but the grace is equally in the going, because the going creates the longing, and the longing keeps you searching. What we are seeking is something different, maqam, a spiritual station, not a state that visits, but a new ground you inhabit permanently, not an experience you have, but a transformation of the one who has experiences. And the only path from hal to maqam is through the full territory of daily life. Not through the cave, not through the retreat, through everything. Through the crying child, through the difficult customer, through the financial crisis, through the moment someone you trusted looks you in the face and lies to you. That is where the practice becomes real. Rumi gave Anwar 3 practices to carry back into his life. Not theories, not concepts. Concrete practices, simple enough to be performed in the middle of any ordinary moment, precise enough to act as genuine instruments of ongoing transformation. The first he called the constant reminder. At any moment of the day, in the middle of a transaction, in the middle of a conversation, in the middle of preparing a meal or walking a familiar street, you pause for the duration of a single breath and ask yourself one question. Am I present now? Not as judgment, not as spiritual evaluation, only as a returning. If you discover you are lost in thought, perfect. That discovery is itself the return to presence. The moment of noticing that you were absent is the moment of being present. If you discover you are already present, equally perfect. Simply acknowledge it. Rest in it for the length of that breath. Then continue with whatever you are doing, but from presence rather than from the automatic machinery of habit. The second practice Rumi called seeing the divine in everything. It sounds, on first encounter, like the kind of gentle spiritual suggestion that dissolves immediately upon contact with a difficult Tuesday morning. But Rumi was precise about how to work with it. He did not offer it as a belief to adopt. He offered it as an experiment to conduct. When you encounter another person, your child, your employee, a stranger whose path crosses yours in a market, you ask yourself a single question. What would change in how I am with this person if they were the divine in disguise? Not as performance, not as affirmation, as a genuine inquiry. How would you listen differently? How would you look at them differently? How would the quality of your attention shift? What would you notice about them that you ordinarily pass over? The third practice was moment-to-moment surrender. Every time something unfolds differently from how you expected or desired, every time the plan breaks, every time life refuses to match the shape you assigned to it, you practice saying internally, without resignation and without performance, "Thy will, not mine." Not from the defeated acceptance of someone who has given up on having preferences. From the trust of someone who has begun to encounter, through direct experience, that there is an intelligence operating in the totality of things that is larger than any single perspective can contain. A pattern that cannot be perceived from inside the moment, but becomes visible when the moment is placed alongside all the other moments it belongs to. Anwar received these three practices in silence. He held them the way you hold something fragile and essential, carefully, with full attention. Because he understood something that the early days of the retreat had not allowed him to understand. That the difficult part was not the retreat. The difficult part was what came after. The return, the ordinary streets of Damascus, the silk shop, the children demanding his attention, the wife who had spent 5 days not knowing whether her husband was alive or lost to some private madness, the business concerns that had not paused during his absence, the creditors and the customers and the competitors, and the 10,000 daily frictions that life in the world generates with absolute reliability. It is one thing to feel the presence of the divine in the silence of an abandoned tavern at 3 a.m, with a realized master sitting across from you, and nothing between you and the truth but your own willingness to receive it. It is something entirely different to feel that same presence when your child is ill, and the doctor is uncertain, and the fear is real, and the hours before dawn are very long and very dark. That, Rumi told him, is the actual practice. Everything else is preparation. The 5th night arrived, and Rumi said something that Anwar had not been expecting. "Tomorrow you leave." Anwar felt panic move through him like cold water. "Already? I have only just begun to understand. There is so much more." Rumi smiled with that particular patience that has nothing to do with waiting and everything to do with fullness. "Exactly," he said. "If you remain, you will begin to mistake the guide for the destination. And the true master does not create dependence. The true master creates freedom. You have had a genuine glimpse of Fana, ego extinction. You have felt the presence. You have begun the emptying of the chalice. But Fana is not the completion. It is the threshold. The other half is Baka, permanence, living from the awakened place in the middle of ordinary existence. And that cannot be learned here, with me, in this retreat from the world. It can only be learned in your life, in the life waiting for you in Damascus. Anwar understood, even as the resistance in him wanted to argue, that Rumi was right. Something had died across these 5 days. The Anwar who had walked into this tavern, full of guilt and confusion and the hollow ache of a life that refused to satisfy despite having everything, no longer existed in the same form. Something had burned in the fire Rumi had kindled, but something new was being born in the same fire. Something that did not yet have a name. Something that did not need one. Rumi explained the 2 poles between which the entire journey of awakening moves. Fana is the death, the dissolution of the false self, the clearing of the mirror, the pouring out of the cup. Baka is the resurrection, the return to the world not as who you were before, but as what you actually are. The drop does not become the ocean through this process. The drop discovers, in direct experience rather than as belief, that it was always the ocean, that the separation was never real, that the story of a self bounded and isolated and fundamentally alone was a story told by a particular organization of consciousness to itself, believed for a lifetime, and now recognized as what it always was. Ibn Arabi mapped this with characteristic precision. He described 3 levels of dissolution. Fana fi shik, dissolution in the teacher. The stage at which the student becomes so genuinely receptive that his own agenda disappears into the teaching, and he absorbs not just the content, but the quality of the transmission. Fana fi Rasul, dissolution in the prophetic archetype. The practitioner begins to embody the qualities that genuine spiritual mastery expresses across all traditions and all ages. Fana fi Allah, dissolution in the divine itself. Nothing remains except the presence, perceiving itself through what was once a separate self. And after Fana, Baka, permanence in the divine. Return to the world as an instrument, not in the mechanical sense, but in the musical sense. A channel through which something larger than any individual life can express itself. Not losing yourself in this, finding yourself for the first time genuinely. Rumi told Anwar a final story before sending him home. There was a man who spent 40 years in a mountain cave practicing in profound silence and solitude. He entered states of extraordinary depth. He had visions. He experienced what he understood to be divine union. He came to consider himself, with genuine and non-performative humility, a saint. After 40 years, he descended from the mountain to carry whatever he had found back to the world below. In the marketplace, someone walking quickly bumped into him, hard, without apology. And the saint felt rage rise in him so fast and so completely that he was halfway through shouting before he was aware he had opened his mouth. In that moment, standing in the marketplace with his own rage still vibrating in the air around him, the saint understood something that 40 years of cave solitude had not been able to teach him. Fana without Baka is incomplete. peace in the cave is not peace. It is simply the absence of the conditions that reveal the absence of peace. Baka is not the capacity for extraordinary states in extraordinary circumstances. Baka is ordinary peace in ordinary circumstances. It is recognizing the divine in the person who bumps into you without apology. It is being the center of the spinning while the spinning continues. It is not needing the world to be different from how it is in order to remain in contact with what you found in the silence. The universe that science has revealed to us in the past century carries a resonance with this teaching that I find extraordinary. Physicists speak of a property called quantum entanglement, the phenomenon by which particles that have once interacted remain connected regardless of the distance between them, such that a change in the state of one is instantaneously reflected in the other, with no signal passing between them and no explanation available within classical physics. The particles are, in some sense that has no analogy in ordinary experience, still one thing. The appearance of separation is real at one level of description. At a deeper level, the connection was never broken. The number 1111 appears in this context not as mysticism, but as a marker. 4 ones, the number of unity repeated in a way that draws attention to itself. In the language of those who work at the intersection of consciousness and physics, it represents the moment when the individual awareness begins to recognize its connection to a larger pattern. Not 4 separate things, one thing appearing as 4. The Sufis would simply say Tawheed, unity. The recognition that the separation was always the appearance, and the unity was always the reality. If you have found yourself noticing this number in unexpected places during a period of significant interchange, you already know, at some level below language, what it is pointing toward. Rumi gave Anwar a final embrace before releasing him back into the world. "One last thing," he said. "People will ask you what happened, where you were, what you found. You will feel the pull toward explaining, toward becoming someone who teaches, someone who guides, someone who saves others from the search. Do not do it. Not yet. Perhaps not ever in that form. Live from the awakened place, silently, without drama. And those who are truly ready will recognize you, not by your words, by your presence. Because awakening is not a teaching that can be transmitted through language. It is a transmission that passes from heart to heart, in silence, the way one candle lights another, not by explaining combustion, but simply by being a light." Anwar left the tavern as the sun was rising over Konya. His legs were unsteady. His body was exhausted in a way that went beyond the physical. But his eyes, those who would see him on the road back to Damascus would later say, carried something in them that had not been there before, something quiet and without edge, something that did not look away. He walked for 3 days back to Damascus, but this time the road was different, not because the road had changed, because he had. This is MindRise Audiobooks, and what comes next is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of its most essential chapter. Anwar returned to Damascus on a Tuesday morning in early autumn. The city smelled of roasting coffee and dry dust, and the particular sweetness of figs left too long in the sun. The streets were exactly as he had left them, the same vendors calling out their wares, the same children running between the legs of adults who were too busy to notice them, the same cats sleeping on the same warm stones. Everything was identical, and nothing was the same. His wife Salima was waiting at the door of their home. She had spent 5 days imagining the worst, the kinds of thoughts that arrive in the small hours and refuse to leave until dawn brings some relief. When she saw him walking down the street, she felt the particular combination of relief and reproach that only someone who has genuinely feared for another person can produce. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her eyes full of everything she had been holding since he left. "Where were you?" she asked, not gently. Anwar stopped before her, and he looked at her, truly looked at her, with the quality of attention he had not given her in years. Not the distracted gaze of a man physically present but mentally elsewhere, running through tomorrow's transactions while nodding at appropriate intervals. He looked at her the way you look at something you recognize you had been taking for granted without knowing you were doing it. The way you look at the sky the first time after a long illness when you finally step outside again. Salima felt it. She could not have named what she felt, but she felt the difference. In 15 years of marriage, she had learned to read the quality of her husband's attention, and this was different from anything she had encountered before. She felt, strangely, as though she were being genuinely seen for the first time. Not as wife, not as mother of his children, not as the domestic anchor of his life, but as herself, whatever that meant. Something in her that she had stopped expecting anyone to notice. "I was learning to die," said Anwar. Salima frowned. She asked the questions any reasonable person would ask, whether he was ill, whether he had gone to some unusual healer, whether something had happened to his mind. And Anwar smiled, a smile Salima did not recognize from the man she had been married to for 15 years. A smile without weight behind it, without agenda, without the subtle urgency of someone who needs to be understood or agreed with or validated. "I am not ill," he said. "I am more alive than I have ever been." He embraced her, not the brief, automatic embrace of ritual and routine, the one given because it is expected, because it fulfills its function and allows the day to continue. He embraced her the way you hold something you have realized you could have lost, with full presence, feeling the warmth of her, the particular way she breathed, the weight of everything she had been carrying during those 5 days of not knowing. And Salima, bewildered and not yet having words for what she was encountering, let herself be held. And in that holding she felt something she would later describe to a friend as coming home to a house she had not known she was away from. The children came then, Hassan at 7, Amira at 5, all speed and noise and the particular physics of small bodies that have been waiting too long for something they love. They threw themselves at him without any of the caution adults learn to impose on their joy. Anwar knelt down. He brought himself to their level. He looked at them the way he had looked at Salima, not as extensions of himself, not as the next generation of his story, not as small projects to be guided toward outcomes he had already determined were correct. He looked at them as complete beings, entire, sufficient, small oceans that had forgotten they were oceans. Hassan saw the tears on his father's face and grew concerned. "Are you sad, Papa?" "No, son," said Anwar. "I am complete." The word meant nothing to Hassan at 7, but something in the quality of his father's voice settled into him like seeds settle into ground, without understanding, without needing to be understood, waiting for the right season. The first days were strange in the way that all genuine transformation produces strangeness when it re-enters ordinary life. The transformation is real, but the world has not changed to accommodate it. The same streets, the same shop, the same ledgers and customers and negotiations and small daily irritations. Externally, Anwar's life was identical to the life he had left. But the one inhabiting that life was different in a way that was difficult to describe and impossible to miss if you were paying attention. Before the retreat, when Anwar walked to the bazaar each morning, his mind was already elsewhere, running through the concerns of the day, calculating what he owed and what was owed to him, mentally rehearsing conversations that might go wrong, replaying conversations that had already gone wrong. His body was on the street of Damascus, but his attention was somewhere in a future that had not yet arrived, or a past that had already departed. He was, in the precise technical sense that the Sufis use, absent from his own life. Now, when he walked, he walked. He felt the ground beneath his feet, the particular texture of the stone, the way the morning air moved against his face before the heat of the day arrived. He heard the city waking, the sounds layering themselves over each other in a way he had never paused to notice before. The call of the first vendor, the protest of a cartwheel needing oil, the distant conversation of two people who believed themselves to be alone. He noticed the light on the walls at that hour, the way it came in at an angle that turned ordinary stone into something that deserved attention. He was on the street of Damascus, and he was there, completely, without division. In the bazaar, when a customer entered his shop, Anwar received them differently. The customer was no longer primarily a transaction, a unit of revenue, a means toward the end of the day's profit. He saw them as what they actually were, another person, carrying whatever they were carrying, navigating whatever they were navigating, arriving in his shop from some life he knew nothing about and could not presume to judge. Another ocean in a human-shaped form. And the customers felt it. You cannot consistently fake this quality of attention, and you cannot consistently hide it when it is genuine. People know at some level below articulation when they are being genuinely seen versus when they are being processed. They relaxed in Anwar's presence in a way they had not before. They spoke more honestly. They stayed longer. They returned. And by some logic that has nothing to do with conventional business strategy, the silk shop began to prosper in ways it had not managed in years of conscientious effort. A difficult customer arrived one afternoon, a caravan merchant named Rashid, known throughout the bazaar for a temper that made other merchants preemptively deferential. He came in like weather, throwing a bundle of silks onto the counter with the contempt of someone who has decided in advance that the encounter will be a battle. "I bought these from you 2 months ago. You told me finest quality. Look at them, faded in the first washing." Before the retreat, Anwar would have defended himself. He would have explained that the silks were exactly as represented, that the customer had clearly washed them incorrectly, that he had a reputation to protect and was not in the habit of selling inferior goods. He would have been right, and it would have made no difference to anything except the temperature of the exchange. Now, Anwar simply looked at Rashid. He looked past the anger, which was real and visible, to what was behind it. Because anger rarely travels alone. Behind this particular anger, Anwar could see pressure, financial difficulty perhaps, or the specific exhaustion of a man who has been fighting his way through a life that has not given him much softness and has come to expect none. A man who arrived at the world with raised fists because raised fists were what the world had taught him the world required. "You are right," said Anwar. Rashid blinked. The word had arrived where he was expecting an argument and had found no resistance, nothing to push against. "What?" "You are right. The silks did not meet your expectations. I am genuinely sorry." Anwar reached under the counter and brought out a selection of his finest stock, material that cost twice what Rashid had originally paid. "Take these, no charge, and if these do not satisfy you either, come back and I will find something that does." Rashid stood in the particular stillness of someone whose entire prepared strategy has been rendered unnecessary. The rage, deprived of the friction it needed to sustain itself, dissolved in a way that left him visibly uncertain how to proceed. I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," said Anwar. "I only hope these serve you better." 3 days later, Rashid returned, without the raised fists, with something in his face that was not quite humility, but was close to it, the expression of a man who has encountered something he did not expect and is still processing what it means. "No one has ever spoken to me the way you did," he said. "In 40 years of doing business in this bazaar, when I came with anger, everyone responded with more anger, or with the kind of false accommodation that is really just fear. You gave me something different. I came to apologize. And I want to be your regular customer, not because you are the cheapest, you are not, but because something happens in this shop that doesn't happen anywhere else." Anwar bowed his head. Rashid became not only his most reliable customer, but one of the most enthusiastic voices for his business across the trade routes. But that was the smaller thing. The larger thing was what Anwar had confirmed for himself. When you stop defending the ego stops requiring defense. When you stop needing to be right, being right becomes irrelevant. When you meet what arrives at you with presence instead of reaction, something changes in the encounter itself. Not because you have deployed a technique, but because genuine presence is genuinely transformative. Months passed. Anwar's transformation did not remain invisible. It is the nature of genuine change that it announces itself not through declarations, but through the quality of daily contact. His wife, Salima, noticed that he had stopped complaining. Not because the things worth complaining about had disappeared. The same taxes, the same competition, the same unpredictability of trade, the same minor daily frictions. But Anwar had stopped needing the world to be other than it was in order to be at peace with it. He had found, or more precisely, had remembered, the center that does not move regardless of what the circumstances are doing. She gathered her courage one evening while he was washing a glass in the kitchen. She had noticed he washed glasses now with a focused attention that she found slightly baffling, and asked him what had actually happened during those 5 days. Anwar paused. He felt the water running over his hands. He heard the sound it made against the ceramic, and then he answered, "I went to the place where stories die." Salima frowned. "I don't understand." "Neither did I," said Anwar. "But I know this now. Your whole life you have been living a story. The story of I, who you are, what you need, what you lack, what has been done to you, and what you have failed to do. And that story creates suffering, not because the events in it are false, but because the story is never complete. It always requires more. It always has problems that need solving, and deficits that need filling, and threats that need managing. The story never rests." He held up the clean glass. "But when the story stops, even for a moment, what remains is this: a glass, water, this moment. And in that simplicity there is a fullness that the story, for all its complexity, could never produce." Salima looked at him for a long time. "I think you have gone mad," she said finally. But she was smiling when she said it, because even though she did not yet have words for what she was perceiving in him, she could feel the difference. And the difference was not madness. The difference was something she might, if pressed, have called peace. One afternoon, as he was preparing to close the shop at dusk, a street child appeared at the entrance, perhaps 8 years old, dirty, thin, with the eyes of someone who has seen more difficulty than childhood should contain. He stood in the doorway with the particular posture of someone who expects to be turned away, but has decided to try anyway. "Sir, do you have any bread? I haven't eaten today." Anwar looked at him, not at the situation, at him, at the specific person standing in the specific doorway at this specific moment. "Wait here," he said. He went to the back of the shop where he kept food for the long days when business kept him past the time of the midday meal. He brought bread and dates and a piece of hard cheese. He gave them to the child. The child took the food with wide eyes. He looked at Anwar with an expression that was something between gratitude and disbelief. "Why are you kind to me? No one is usually kind to me." Anwar knelt down. He met the child's eyes at the child's level, and he said something that surprised even himself in its directness. "Because when I look at you, I do not see a street child. I see the divine in disguise." The child did not understand the words, but something in the quality of the statement, the simple, unperformative certainty of it, reached him anyway. Something in him felt recognized in a way that had not happened before. He left with the food, and Anwar remained in the empty street at dusk and understood something that Rumi had told him, that he was only now understanding viscerally, in the body rather than in the mind. Every encounter is sacred. Every person is a walking threshold. And every act of genuine service is a form of prayer, not directed at something separate from the encounter, but expressed through it. A woman came to him eventually. Her name was Layla. She had heard of Anwar, though he had told no one and sought no reputation, in the way that water finds its own level and genuine presence finds those who need it. She sat across from him in his shop after hours and told him that her husband had betrayed her, that 2 years had passed, that she had tried everything she knew to forgive and could not, and that she was now carrying not only the original wound, but the guilt of failing to heal it on the schedule that everyone around her considered appropriate. Anwar listened to all of it.
Then he asked her a single question. Who said you must forgive on a schedule that belongs to someone else? Layla looked at him as though he had said something dangerous. Everyone. My family, the Imam, every book I've read about healing. And what do you feel when you hear that you should forgive? I feel that if I forgive before I'm ready, I'm saying what he did was acceptable. I feel like I would be abandoning myself. Anwar nodded slowly. Then do not forgive. Not yet. Forgiveness is like fruit. It ripens in its own time. If you force it before it is ready, what you produce is not forgiveness, it is performance. Your rage is telling you something real and important. It is saying, what happened to me mattered. My pain matters. Honor that. Feel it completely
without rushing it toward a resolution that the pain has not yet become ready to offer. What keeps you trapped is not the rage itself. It is the shame you feel about having it. Layla wept in the way that people weep when they have been given permission to feel what they have been trying not to feel. Not dramatically, deeply. 6 months later, she returned to tell him that the forgiveness had arrived on its own, the way the end of a season arrives, not through effort, but through the completion of a process that had its own timing and its own intelligence. People began to gather around Anwar in the way that water gathers in low places, not because he announced himself, not because he sought it, but because the quality of what he carried was perceptible to those who needed it, and the world is reliably full of those who need it. He called what formed not a school and not a circle, but simply a gathering. People came and sat together, sometimes in silence, sometimes in conversation, and something happened in that shared space that was larger than the sum of its individual participants. One evening, a young man came who reminded Anwar, with a precision that stopped his breath, of himself 20 years earlier. The same desperate searching in the eyes, the same sense of someone who has been looking for something he cannot name for so long that the looking has become indistinguishable from suffering. I have heard that you know something, the young man said. Something about finding peace. About awakening. Can you teach me? Anwar recognized the smile that arrived on his face before he had decided to smile. He recognized it because he had first seen it on the face of Rumi in that abandoned tavern on the first night of everything. I cannot teach you anything, said Anwar, because you already know everything you need to know. You have only forgotten. The young man frowned with the frustration of someone who has traveled a significant distance for an answer and has been offered a riddle instead. Then how do I remember? Anwar pointed to the abandoned tavern at the end of the street, the same tavern where his own journey had begun 2 decades before. Go there, sit in silence, and wait. Wait for what? Wait for the thirst to become stronger than the fear. And when that happens, everything will begin. The young man bowed and left, not quite understanding, but carrying in him, Anwar could see it, the seed of something that would eventually find its season. The cycle continued, the ocean calling to the wave, the presence hiding inside human form and then recognizing itself again and again in an eternal movement of forgetting and remembering that is not a problem to be solved, but a game being played by the one consciousness with infinite patience and infinite love. 1 year after his return,
Anwar walked back to the tavern alone. Not without food or water this time, not in desperation. From choice, from gratitude. He walked for 3 days, and the road was entirely different from what it had been, not because it had changed, but because the one walking it had died and been reborn since the last time he had made this journey. He sat in the same place where he had sat when Rumi had found him. He closed his eyes, and in the silence he heard a voice, not external, not the voice of another person, but the voice of what had always been present at the center of his awareness, beneath every story, beneath every fear, beneath every mask he had ever worn. Welcome home, beloved. You never left. You were only playing at being lost. Was the game worth playing? And Anwar, for the first time in his life with genuine completeness, laughed. He laughed at the cosmic elegance of it, that he had spent years reaching desperately for what he had never been separated from, that he had suffered from the experience of being alone, when aloneness had never been the truth, that he had tried to arrive somewhere he had never left. And in that laughter there was something that had no adequate name in any language. A freedom that was not the freedom from circumstances, but the freedom that is the nature of what you actually are when you stop mistaking yourself for what you are not. The stars appeared. Night came slowly. Anwar remained seated, not meditating, not seeking, not doing anything that required a name, simply being. And in that simple being, in that space of pure presence without agenda, without past or future, without the narrator and without the story, everything was contained. The beginning and the end, birth and dissolution, the forgetting and the remembering, all of it arising and passing within the one consciousness, the consciousness that was before time, the consciousness that will remain after time, the consciousness that you are, not the small, bounded, defended version that fears for its survival, but the real one, the one that was never born and will never die, the one that has been here the entire time, beneath every thought you ever had about yourself, waiting with infinite patience for you to become still enough to notice. The Sufis speak of 3 levels of understanding. The first is Islam, surrender. Not the religion, the state. When you stop fighting what is, when you release the chronic resistance to the present moment that consumes most of human energy most of the time. When you say yes to your actual life rather than to the life you believe you should have been given. The second is Iman, trust. When you move beyond mere acceptance of what is into genuine trust that what is carries an intelligence you cannot always perceive but can learn to feel. When you stop needing to understand the pattern in order to cooperate with it. The third is Ihsan, excellence. When you live every moment in the full awareness that you are in the presence of something sacred. Not God as external audience, God as the very substance of the present moment. When every gesture, however small, becomes an act of devotion, not because you are performing devotion, but because devotion is what arises naturally when the separation between yourself and the sacred has genuinely dissolved. Most people, Rumi told Anwar,
remain at the first level their entire lives, or never even arrive there. Some reach the second. Very few touch the third with any consistency. But the direction is always the same: inward, deeper, past the story and the identity and the accumulated armor of a life lived in protection from the full weight of what it means to be alive. Toward the center that has never moved. Toward the stillness that has never been disturbed. Toward what you were before you learned to be afraid. Rumi placed his hand over his own heart when he departed from Anwar that final time. And in that gesture, simple, unhurried, without drama, Anwar felt everything that cannot be transmitted through language. The love that has no object. The recognition that asks for nothing in return. The transmission that passes not through words or concepts or even through sustained practice, but through the simple proximity of two presences, one of which has remembered what the other is in the process of remembering. When Rumi left, Anwar did not look back, because he understood at last that the external master had completed his function. The mirror had done its work. What had been reflected in it was not Rumi. It had never been Rumi. What had been reflected was Anwar's own deepest nature, showing itself to itself through the particular clarity of a realized human being. And now the inner master, the presence itself, which has no form and no history and no name, was his guide. This master does not depart, cannot depart, is not located in any particular direction you might look, is not accessible through any particular technique you might practice, is simply what is most fundamentally present at the center of your experience in this moment and every moment, whether you are aware of it or not. It is always there. At the center of your chest, in the silence between one thought and the next, in the stillness that underlies all motion, waiting, though waiting implies time, and what waits here is prior to time, for you to become quiet enough to feel it. And now, to you who have listened through to this final moment, this was never only Anwar's story. It was always your story, the story of someone who searched and suffered and surrendered, and discovered that what they had been searching for was the one thing that could not be found by searching, because it was never lost, because it was the searcher. Stop searching. Begin remembering. Not as instruction, as invitation. Because what you are seeking is not located in some future state of spiritual achievement. It is not waiting for you on the other side of a particular practice or a particular realization or a particular number of years of sincere effort. It is here, now, in the silence that exists beneath these words, in the awareness that is listening, in the presence that you have always been, underneath your name, underneath your history, underneath everything that was given to you and everything that was taken away. There is something in you that was never born and will never die. Something that was present before your first memory and will remain after your last. Something that cannot be harmed by what has harmed you, cannot be diminished by what has diminished you, cannot be lost by what you have lost. That is what you are. Not the small version, the real one. If something in this journey moved through you, if any moment in these 4 chapters felt less like encountering new information and more like recognizing something you already carried, then you have already begun. Not because of anything you did, because of what you are. Because the remembering, when it arrives, always feels like coming home. Because home was never somewhere you needed to travel to. It was always here. Some people, when they reach a moment of genuine inner recognition, feel drawn to mark it quietly, not as performance, not as demonstration, but as a private signal to themselves that something shifted. Like leaving a stone on a path to indicate you passed through. If this journey opened something in you, perhaps you already know what that signal looks like for you. Numbers appear throughout mystical traditions not as magic, but as markers, points of alignment, moments of resonance between inner and outer reality. 888 represents, in traditions spanning cultures and centuries, the principle of abundance flowing through alignment. Not material abundance alone, but the abundance that becomes available when the self stops contracting in fear and opens to what is already present. And 520, in a tradition that understands the deeper mathematics of the heart, represents love in its most complete form, not as emotion, not as transaction, but as the fundamental nature of consciousness itself when the obscurations have been cleared away. If something in what you heard tonight resonates at a frequency beneath thought, if some part of you recognizes rather than merely understands, then perhaps you are already one of those for whom the path has a way of placing exactly the right encounter before exactly the right person at exactly the right moment. Not by accident, by the logic of a deeper order than the one we ordinarily navigate by. The seekers who find their way to this kind of transmission do not find it by accident, just as Anwar did not find Rumi by accident, just as you did not find this story by accident. Something in you was already in motion before the first word arrived. Something in you already recognized the door before it opened. Trust that. Stay close to what opens you rather than what closes you. Stay close to the silence. Stay close to the thirst, not to extinguish it, but to follow it all the way to its source. Because its source and your source are the same. They were always the same. This is MindRise Audiobooks, in memory of all who searched until they remembered there was nothing to search for. In gratitude to the one presence that plays this eternal game of hiding and finding. In honor of every master who pointed at the truth without mistaking themselves for it. What you seek is seeking you.